Welcome. It is Friday, February 26th. Wow, the month is over
So
uh,
fast.
so fast, lightning fast.
Yeah.
And we know that this month has been designated as Black History Month. But here at Say Something, we see Black history as something that occurs every day. 365 days. Black history is American history. Black history is created every minute, every hour of the day, of the week by change makers. Some you know, and some you may not know, but they are doing great things. Black History Month is a time where we recognize the African American change makers, liberators, and thought leaders behind every single movement you can think of. An African American was there. It's time to recognize their resilience, their wisdom, their ingenuity. It's also time to celebrate them and to be inspired to action by the contributions of African Americans. And so, again, it doesn't just happen today, it doesn't just happen this month, but it's all the time. And so, I am delighted to be here because I have my co host. Why don't you check in?
Hi, I'm Annalisa, everyone, coming at you from LA. And it is a good day to celebrate some of the work that this amazing Black woman with us today is doing. So I'm so glad to be here.
Yes, and I'm in LA as well. And so today, we get to be in the midst of a change maker. Uh, Dr. Kimberly Narain, she holds an MD, a PhD, and an MPH. She is also my primary care physician. I just have to throw it out there, folks, because um, at this stage of my life, this was the first time I got a sister to be my doctor. And so I want everybody to know, yes, I want you to know this, but she's also the author of a book that has come to us in such a timely way. And it is the moment for this book to be recognized as well as the author. And I want to just read a little bit from this book. And it's actually on the back cover. And it states, throughout America's history, people from all different backgrounds and racial groups have worked together to overcome racism and bring America closer to equal opportunity for everyone. But the effects of structural racism are still felt today in many ways. And people need to continue to work together to help make the American dream a reality for everyone. You know, structural racism, systemic racism, and the residual effects, and the reality of us living in this system for over 400 years is something that is still very difficult for people to talk about. And for some people, they're not even aware of. So just imagine, how do we talk to our children about racism, around structural racism? Well, Kimberly, who also is a mother, knew that this book had to be written. So I want Dr. Kim to step in, and let's get this conversation going and share with us what inspired you to write this book.
Yeah, I think over the summer we were seeing one atrocity after the next. Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd. And it's not like these things are new, but I think it was the focus and the outcry that just would not allow these things to be ignored. And I think it really pushed me to try to think about how to give my daughter appropriate context for how to understand and place these events. I did not want to make it about the individuals because sadly, I knew it wasn't going to be the last time. So I started thinking about, how do I talk to her about this? And I started going through my bookshelves and, I found all these lovely books that talked about how your skin is beautiful and, my skin is beautiful and we're all equal. And that's great. But it was just really ringing very hollow, to me at that time, because if everyone is beautiful and we're all equal, then how could something like this still happen? So I, was very uncertain, but I said, okay, I'm just going to start writing something. I'm going to start creating a resource for myself, because what I was up against was I don't want to shatter her innocence. I'm thinking about my 7-year-old daughter, she's happy and joyful and, has got all types of friends. So I was really worried about, sort of, I don't know, sort of throwing a wet blanket, on her childhood experience. So I was ambivalent, but I was like, okay, I'm just going to start writing. I'm going to start pulling some key, resources, some Sentinel events. And, I really got, I think, just something that just really let me know that I was heading in the right direction. We were talking about somebody needing to be quarantined for COVID-19. And she asked me, oh, is quarantine like segregation? And I said, no, so I started to explain to her about what segregation, was. And she says to me, oh, that's rude. And she says, I'm so glad Martin Luther King solved racism. And it hit me like a ton of bricks that there are so many adults that have that same view, so I said, I have to keep going, so George Floyd was buried on the 9th of June. By the 13th, I had a working outline. And once I did that, I said, okay, I need to reach out to people who sort of study these issues as a living, because I came at this as a mom, not as an expert, right? A mom is a different type of expertise, but being an academic, I appreciate the unique, added value of somebody that has studied this and been in this area, for their lives. So I reached out to Joan Reed, who is the Dean of Diversity and Community Partnerships at Harvard. And she's a pediatrician, but she's also got expertise in child psychiatry. So my first question to her was, will this traumatize a kid? Because that was not my goal. I wanted it to be illuminating and I wanted it to be empowering. And, once I got the sign off from her and she thought it was great, I started bringing in some other people, another friend of mine. Her name is Ashanta Tumblin. She is actually a professor in pediatrics at USC. So we had done a fellowship together, and her fellowship project actually was on interviewing parents about how they talk to their kids about race. So I brought her in and was like, look at this. What do you think? She signed off. Another one of my good friends, Kafaya Tajani, who is actually a middle school history teacher, had worked in inner cities, for the bulk of her career, had her look at it as well, pulled in another assistant dean of diversity and equity from David School of Medicine at UCLA, my friend Dan Cosman. And once I kind of had their sign off on it, I said, okay, I can move forward, with talking to illustrators and things like that. So, I did that. But the other thing that I wanted to do was to do a deeper dive with the literature regarding how you actually talk to children. And to my surprise, what I found was this is what's been being advocated for people, that are in this space. So people like Mary Fesperman, who had done a content analysis looking at the most popular 3 out of the 4 social studies books for children. And she just really outline beautifully with her content analysis the ways in which these textbooks, which are, all over the United States, really undergird the status quo. So, they were doing things like minimization. So a word like racism would not be mentioned if it came up at all, whereas the word freedom came up 75 times, across these books. So what does that do? It gives the impression that these symbolic social goods are available to everyone equally. The other thing they did was essentially reinforce segregation. So showing minorities in very stereotypical roles, not showing racial ethnic groups, working together. She did this beautiful sort of photo analysis. So any photos that had a group of people, the majority of them did not show people of multiple races. She talked about othering, so how you relegate minorities to your cultural specific, sections instead of integrating them throughout the entire text, how you would highlight the race of the minority, but not of a white individual. So what does that do? It suggests that culture is something associated with the others and not associated with white people, which positions that as the default and normative. The other thing would be underrepresenting people, so not showing them in their proportion, that they exist in the United States. So Asians, Hispanics, Native Americans, really underrepresentation. And this sort of contributes to this idea of the perpetual foreigner, essentially, by us not being integrated. And the last thing that she talked about was just this reification of white supremacy. So she did this storyline analysis, and it was looking at who are the heroes, who solves conflict, who's positioned to elicit empathy. And, essentially all the time, it was white individuals and minorities were positioned as a source of conflict, so really,
This is so much. How do you get it into a kid's book?
yeah, so, obviously you don't include all of that, but, there are some specific approaches I think that I tried to do with this book. One, confronting some of these narratives head on. So this idea of minimization or ignoring. So we, center racism. This is not something that's often to the side, in a cultural civil rights section. This book really kind of takes it head on. It really looks at the mechanisms that, underlie, structural racism. So essentially making the invisible to children visible. So it's, showing that structural racism is really about the values, the organizations, the policies, and practices that lead to differences in access to, control of labor, access to material goods, neighborhoods, things of that nature, and access to, symbolic social goods. So this justice, this freedom, this democracy in a way that is patterned, by race, is essentially when we don't talk about it, kids come to the realization, you know, relative value of races on their own. So we think that we're protecting them when we don't talk about it, but they're soaking up the environment. So they see that certain people are in certain neighborhoods and certain types of people are represented in certain professions, and certain people are not, and they come to their conclusions about the hierarchy. They are, modeling these racial dynamics by the time they're 3 years old in play. Um, by the time they're 7, kids can identify what stereotypes go with which particular group with about 70% accuracy. So really by the time a kid becomes 10, a lot of these beliefs are baked in, and you really lose the window because the empathy really dissipates. In terms of sort of the opportune time to really sort of start to get at this, is somewhere around 7. You can start to talk about this stuff. Why? Because they've got a heightened focus on fairness. They are at the top, in terms of their ability to experience empathy. Um, they're really trying to carve out their identity and develop their moral compass in the way that they want to be in the world. And they are really at a point where they start to have some of the cognitive skills to be able to challenge sort of normative assumptions. So I've kind of been converted to think about, in terms of really addressing equity, the return on investment is really with the kids. And this is coming from an internal medicine doctor. So
Kimberly, do you have a sense of how children are responding to this book?
I do. So it's variable, right? It's going to be, so I have to be perfectly honest with my daughter. It jarred her a little bit, she's like, oh, I don't like this, kind of thing, but I came down on the side for her particularly that I would rather her confront these issues in a safe space where she can ask questions. I think who wouldn't want to be in a world where Martin Luther King solved racism? I certainly would want to be, but I rather have her deal with these issues with me, to be exposed with me. Other, children have, sort of taken this information. My goddaughter, who is 7, she did a book report on it, and shared the information with her class. A young lady posted herself on Twitter having the conversation with her 9-year-old daughter using the book, and the daughter gave a review and, indicated how she felt like it was empowering and how she wasn't stopped, So I think there's a range, but nonetheless, I think, it's extremely valuable. And, surprisingly to me, I'm getting a lot of messages from parents that say, oh my goodness, thank you. I've learned so much. I am now going to digest this information and then share this, back with my younger child, or, I'm going to make changes with how I operate, so it's really an introduction to structural racism for both kids and parents.
And I tell you, sometimes it's almost best to have a book like this to introduce adults who just unaware to help start the conversation. I started out saying so timely, and every step along the way, as you're unpacking your process, we're sort of really understanding the residual effects of racism and how much has been hidden from us. And how, telling the true history, and not, walking away from it, denying it, is so important during this time, if there ever was a time. As we close out our conversation, you know, what's the message you'd like to give folks? And that could be anybody that you think of. Annalise and I, we're in this stage of our lives that where it's like, it's time for action. It's time to call people out if they have to be called out. So what are some of your call out or call to action measures that you'd like to give the listener and the viewer?
I think most importantly, I would say think very thoughtfully about what you want your children to glean and children in your life, about race and racism, because passive, socialization, which happens a lot, is really undergirding the status quo. So it is really allowing the status quo to be seen as normative. So like you think about math or like you think about a cultural practice, I think strategically, because I feel like myself as somebody who thinks a lot about these issues in the context of my own work, I almost missed the boat with my own child, and if my child would have, I guess, come away from, being raised by me with the impression that she was more deserving of opportunities than other individuals just because she so happened to be born with more resources, I think I would have felt like that was a failure. So I think, I've got an opportunity to not only, make her aware, but to stimulate her to give back in whatever way that she chooses. Because I do believe that to whom much is given, much is required. So I think by us starting to have the conversation about how her experiences may not mirror that of, many other people that look like her, she does not have the luxury of going about her way, taking these opportunities and thinking about her happy life as an individual. So I would say, even for our allies, those with the best intentions, colorblind discussions about equality, egalitarian discussions about race can be detrimental.
Yeah.
Because if we all have the same opportunities, we all have the same access, then what we're left with to explain the current status quo is cultural inferiority. So even though it's the best intentions and, to say everybody is equal, it is wholly insufficient.
Mhm.
I totally agree. And I'm just going to add to your call to action because I'm always about fighting the status quo. I think that, the status quo is something that is not empowering us. And this kind of this kind of being anesthetized to it. Do you like how I threw that medical term in there, Renee?
Yes,
This is not serving us. I love that you've, written this book for children and have created a vehicle for conversation to happen in families and, between parents and their children. I think it's so important. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, I want to say yes, yes, and yes. I said it already. The time for this book has not only come, but it is so important that the work that comes from reading this book, because it helps you understand about the work you need to do. When we talk about, dismantling racism, it's work that we all have to do. But what this book does for me, it's not work that's just set aside for the scholars and the researchers or the allies. It's work that our children have to do, their parents, their caregivers, and every single person in this country has a responsibility to do the work.
Yeah.
That is indeed, in my mind, the only way we're going to see some type of change for people who are constantly living in this system of structural racism as we know it. So thank you, Dr. Narain. We
you.
are so gifted and blessed to have you. And we welcome you back again. This is the book, The Cycle of a Dream, A Kid's Introduction to Structural Racism by Dr. Kimberly Narain. You want to get a copy? Go to Amazon right now. You can get one and maybe buy one for someone else and gift them with this book. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for sharing your platform. I